If I were to say to you 9/11, everyone in this room would instantly recall the events of that day. You probably would recall instantly where you were at as all of these things unfolded. I was actually in a little town called Columbus, New Mexico, about 100 miles due west of El Paso, Texas. I can tell you that it is smaller than Chesterfield even thought about being. Small place. I was a half a mile off the U.S.-Mexican border, and I woke up, as many of you did, to the planes crashing into the towers. As the events of the day unraveled, things just really began to bother me. I was 2,000 miles away from Tammy and Corey. I was all by myself out in Columbus, New Mexico, getting ready to cross over into Mexico, actually, to buy some produce to have shipped back to the U.S. But I was 2,000 miles away from all those that I knew and that I loved, that I cared about. And the sad part about it, I was unable to get in touch with Tammy. I mean, phone lines were jammed. It was just, cell towers were it was a crazy day. And, of course, if you remember those events, you recall that as well. I was not enjoying that morning at all. Border Patrol agents were riding up and down the U.S. border there like fighter jets. It was absolutely amazing. I tried to cross over into Mexico to go to work, and of course they didn't let us do that. They kept us all on the U.S. side. Now, I don't believe anyone will ever forget the look on President Bush's face when he was sitting in that second grade classroom and they told him what was transpiring that morning. But there's something else that's significant about that day. Because of that date, because of the things that happened, another department was formed within our cabinet levels of government. And of course, that cabinet department is called to serve the president as well as protect its citizens. And it's called the Department of Homeland Security. In fact, their stated goal is to prepare for, prevent, and respond to homeland emergencies, particularly terrorism. Now, I want you to note the key word there in that department: home. And friends, the greatest way to protect the homeland is to protect the homes in the land. So with that in mind, we're going to begin a series of messages that I have entitled Homeland Security. And our focus for this series is going to be based on the Ten Commandments. Because in my opinion, I believe the greatest way to protect our homes is to teach our homes the what and the why of the Ten Commandments. Now, I'm not the first person that decided or that thought, that even made the statement that the Ten Commandments and Homeland Security went together. James Madison, one of the founding fathers of the American Constitution, said this: "We have staked the whole future of American civilization not upon the power of government, far from it. We have staked the future of our politics upon the capacity of each and all of us to govern ourselves and to control ourselves according to the Ten Commandments of God." What an amazing statement. What a thought. But that also led me to some questions that I need to ask. Do the Ten Commandments really carry that kind of clout? Do they really carry that kind of authority or that kind of power? I mean, after all, there are only 10 of them, one for each finger. And you can recite all of them in less than a minute. I mean, do they really have that much power? I mean, the Bible even calls them in Exodus 34:28, it simply calls them the 10 words. Yet here's the problem. As simple and as short as they are, most of us don't know them. And you obviously can't keep commandments that you don't know. A Gallup poll a few years back made this revelation. It said that while 85% of Americans believe in the Ten Commandments, then they're still binding today, only 15% could name 5 of them. Now you and I might think, well, that's not too bad considering the world at large, and especially in America and the non-Protestant believer, the non-Christian people that we have in this country. But Newsweek magazine did a subsequent poll that reported this. Of people who go to church, only 49% of all Protestants and 44% of all Roman Catholics could name 4 of the Ten Commandments. Kind of reminds me of the Sunday school teacher who was teaching on the Ten Commandments one time and asked the students, the kids in the class, said, kids, can anybody in here list the Ten Commandments in any order? Of course, little Johnny raised his hand. Said, I can, teacher. She said, okay, Johnny, go ahead. He said, 3, 6, 1, 8, 4, 5, 9, 2, 10, and 7. I was tempted to give you guys a pop quiz this morning. And then I read that story and I thought, no, I probably better not do that. I might get the same response. But folks, on a more serious note, it's not enough just to know the Ten Commandments. I believe that we must live the Ten Commandments, that we must teach the Ten Commandments to our children if we're ever going to have homeland security. Now let me show you the reason I say that to you. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, Moses restated the Ten Commandments and that, from when he had received them on Mount Sinai. But then in chapter 6 of Deuteronomy, Moses gives these instructions to us. Guys, put this up on the screen. Deuteronomy 6, verses 6 and 7. I want you to see this. There you go. And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. So parents are to teach their kids these commands. They're not only to learn them, but they're to live them. And here's the reason why. Deuteronomy 5:29 says this. Oh, that they have had such a heart in them that they would fear me and always keep all my commandments, that it might be well with them and with their children forever. The be well is that security of homeland. So let's begin with the commandments and looking at all 10 of them first. Starting in chapter 20 of the book of Exodus is where we'll be hanging our hat. We're going to start there in verse 1. And God spoke all of these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt and out of the house of bondage. And you shall have no other gods before me. And you shall not make for yourselves a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is the earth beneath, or that is in the water underneath the earth. And you shall not bow down to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the 3rd and 4th generations of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. And you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. In 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work. You, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and day and hallowed it. Verse 12. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God has given you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor's. Now, we're going to take the next 10 weeks and look at each one of those commandments. But now, even before we get into these, I want to ask you what the first commandment, and of course probably everyone in here, as we just read, knows what that is. But let me ask you this in this respect. Why is that commandment number one? Why is the number one commandment number one? I believe the first commandment is the very first commandment, not but just because it's the number one in the line of succession. I believe it's the number one commandment because it is foundational to the other 9. Folks, if we don't understand the very first commandment, the other 9 mean absolutely nothing. The first commandment forces us to ask the question, who's number one? So I want to open up this morning and let's talk about this a little bit. And the first thing I want you to see is that God deserves our undivided attention. Picture this. It was the 3rd day of the 3rd month about 3,500 years ago. God had literally snatched out of the jaws of slavery a ragtag, totally unimpressive group of people called the Israelites. He snatched them out of the greatest military power in the entire world. God then promised them that He would make them into a great nation and bring them into their own land. But before He did that, He brought them to this place called Mount Sinai. And so not just to give them a place to hang out and rest for a little while, but so that He could literally reveal His heart to them. Give them what He dubs His love for them. In fact, if you think about it, and if you go back and you study from Genesis all the way to now, this is the very first time that God actually speaks directly to man. I mean, He says that there in the very first parts. He said, and God spoke all these words, saying. God literally spoke to all men, directly to the nation of men, this very first time here in Exodus 20. And I think what's interesting is the first thing He says, and notice that, because before He tells His people what He wants them to do, He tells them who He is. Verse 2 says, I am the Lord. I am the Lord. That one statement is the bedrock for everything that we know. It's the bedrock for everything that we do. It's the revelation of all of Scripture. I am the Lord. In that one statement, we find that there is only one Lord. There is only one God. This revelation is one indivisible. It's almighty. It's all sovereign. It's an all-knowing God who is still unique today as He was when He penned these words on tablets. One God. And then He gets deeper. And He says, in fact, look at the words between Lord and God. I am the Lord, your God. He makes it personal. He immediately establishes that He is the only Lord, the only Lord of the universe. And then He says, listen, I want a personal relationship with you. Not only am I the Lord that created everything that you have, but I want a personal relationship with each and every one of you. This is his bedrock foundation of everything that He is and everything that we have in Him. Now, this is something that is extremely, vitally important that we need to understand, really, even before we move past to the next area of that, even that verse. You see, because here's the deal. The laws that we're going to be studying, and the law that we're studying now, it's not something that was given to the Israelites to make them the nation of God's people. It wasn't laws or rules that was set down that said, if you abide by these rules, you will be my people. No, it was given to them because they were God's people already. He claimed them for their own. I am the Lord your God. Therefore, I give you these commandments, these in which to live by. You don't keep the 10 Commandments in order to have a relationship with God. You keep them because you have a relationship with God. Don't miss that scenario. God did not give us the Ten Commandments so that we could have a relationship with Him. We keep them because we do have a relationship with Him. These are not just for religious people. They are not just for everybody. They are guidelines for God's family. Growing up, Daddy set rules at the house. Imagine that. He probably needed to for me, I know. But what he did was when he establishes those rules for the house, it was do your homework, do your chores, don't talk back to your mama, and be home on time. But now understand, Daddy did not give us those rules because we lived in his house. He did not give us those rules so that we would become his children. He gave us those rules because we were his children. And that's the way he expected us to live. God did the same thing by placing these laws or these rules in order, by setting these forth on the tablet of stone, which are pasted all across this country, all across this world. This is not how you become my child. This is how you live as my child. So, I am the Lord, your God. And look what he says next. Who brought you out of the land of Egypt and out of the house of bondage. God was reminding the Israelites here that not only was he their God, not only was he their personal God, but that he was also their Savior, their Redeemer, their salvation. Now there are some people who think that the Old Testament is nothing but the law of God, and in fact there's and in the New Testament is nothing but all about the grace of God. But right here in this one verse, not only do we see the fact that God is the law, but we also see that in this one verse that the Old Testament is full of grace because of who God is and what he did. I mean, think about it. What did God do right here? What is God talking about? He brought them out of the land of Egypt. He brought them out of the house of bondage. I mean, he restored them. He rescued them. He redeemed them. Not because of anything that they had done. They ran from God. They hid from God. They disobeyed God. He saved them because he loved them. I say that simply because in the first 19 chapters, we know all about their story. If you didn't have the first 19 chapters, you certainly couldn't understand chapter 20. You couldn't see how all of this fits together. I mean, the Israelites, the nation of Israel, they were trapped. They didn't have any place to go. They didn't have any city to call their own. They were slaves. They were incarcerated by the Egyptian army. God heard their cries. God saw their tears, and he answered their prayer. He sent plagues and disease to the land. And then finally, on the night that we talk about being the Passover, he sent the death angel to come and kill every firstborn of the nation except those who had placed the blood of the lamb across the doorpost of their homes. That night, Israel learned perhaps the greatest lesson that God had ever taught. In fact, and of course the lesson is simply this: if you will trust me, and if you will trust the blood that I shed for you, I will save you from your sins. Folks, that's a lesson that we need to take to the bank. It's something that we need to write on the doorpost of our hearts. In fact, I'll go one further. It's something that we need to write on the doorpost of our homes. So that every time we walk in them, every time we walk out them, that we remember that what we are doing is that we are trusting our lives with the Lord Jesus Christ. We are trusting everything we have to God. And because God shed his blood for us, then we're good to go. That we don't have to worry. In that simple sentence is probably the greatest lesson in all of history. And again, certainly something that you and I need to be reminded of from time to time. Of course, then you have to go back and think about, well, they come to the Red Sea, and they're standing there with this large body of water in front of them, and Pharaoh's army tracking them down and getting ready to kill them and murder them. What does God do? He parts the water, allows them to cross, gives them the path, gives them the way. And then as they cross and the last one's out and Pharaoh's army comes rushing in, what does he do? He protects them again. He closes the water back up. And then, of course, the Israelites, as they continued to wander in the land and in the wilderness, when they got thirsty, what did God do? He busted open the rocks and allowed the water to pour out. When they got hungry, what did He do? He gave them what the Bible calls manna, the bread from heaven. And then, and only after that, God set His people free and gave Him His law. Now, don't miss that order. Before God gave the Israelites rules to live by, He first delivered them from slavery. He first redeemed them from their captors. He first established them as His people. You know, many people think that the Old Testament salvation came by keeping the law. And again, in the New Testament, it came by grace. But folks, the truth is that salvation has always come by grace. You don't keep the law to earn the grace of God. It is the grace of God that enables you to keep the law of God. Remember, you don't need to keep God's rules to have a relationship with Him. You keep them because you do have a relationship with Him. Just as with the Israelites, God had already proven that He can meet every need that you and I have. What He wants in return is simply and exclusively our trust and our worship and our love and our commitment to Him. He said, in fact, that because I am who I am and because what I have done for you, I want your undivided attention. For I am the Lord, your God. Not only does He want our undivided attention, He also desires our undivided affection. Now, this is going to come as a real shock to many of you. But the Ten Commandments aren't about the law of God. The Ten Commandments are not about the law of God. The Ten Commandments are about the love of God. I mean, His love for us and our love for Him. When He said, I am the Lord your God, He was signifying that it's not just enough to believe in God. For God has to be your God, the God that you love and the God that loves you. He has got to be first in your life. Look down at verse 3. For you shall have no other gods before me. Notice in that command that God doesn't speak to us in a multiple form. Listen to what He says. You shall have no other gods before me. You being personal. You being singular. Yourself. And look what it says there. It doesn't say before us. It says before me. Singular. God Himself. Folks, this God is the God that we're to worship. This God that we worship is not a God. He's not some God. He is the God. And He wants exclusive relationship, a love relationship with each one of us. God who gave these commandments is not primarily a God of the law. He is primarily a God of love. And He wants us to love Him just as much as He loves us. In fact, Jesus said it Himself in John 14, verse 21. He said, and he who has my commandments and keeps them, it is he who loves me. And he who loves me and will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and manifest myself to him. It is about the love of God, not about the law of God. I mean, if that's true, you can't separate the law of God from the love of God. But you certainly can't have the law of God or the love of God without the law of God. You see, it all works hand in hand. Now, just in case you think I'm imposing my beliefs on these 10 commandments, I want you to recall the story that we read over in Matthew about the lawyer who come to trick Jesus. And he asked him a question. Y'all remember what the question was? He says in Matthew, I think chapter 22, he says, what is the greatest commandment of the law? Thought he'd try to trip Jesus up. But what did Jesus say? You remember what he said? He said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, all your strength. And this commandment is the greatest. And then he says, what? To love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus took the 10 commandments that God had wrote in stone and cut them down to 2. Love God, love others. He said, that's it. If you love God, you'll love others. It's not about a law. It's about love. In other words, Jesus, again, had basically taken 10 and cut them down into 2. Now I don't want us to miss that. We mull over all of these 10 commandments, and they're important, and we need to live by them. We need to teach them. But the thing that we need to remember is that the first 4 commandments are about loving God, and the other 6 are about loving others. It's about love, not about the law. It's about a relationship that begins with Jesus Christ and extends into God. It's a relationship that He and I have for you. We want our homeland secure. We want our home secure. Love God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, and all your strength. Don't just act, do it. Do it. The Bible doesn't say, again, that God is the law. What does the Bible call God? He said God is love. God is not law. And just as Jesus took those 10 commandments and shrunk them down into 2, you can actually boil those 10 commandments down into one word. And that is not the word law, but the word love. And that's why God said, I am the Lord your God. That's why He begins there. Because it's about a relationship personally with you and I. I am the God who you trust. I am the Lord your God who desires that personal, loving, living relationship with you. I am the God who delivered you from the house of bondage. I am the God who rescued you and redeemed you and restored you from the sin of eternal damnation. Nobody loves you like I do. Nobody will ever love you like I do. And nothing or anything can ever be replaced by me. And all I want from you is your love. That's all He wants. He wants you. Folks, God desires our undivided affections. But God also demands our undivided allegiance. First, God tells us who He is. I am the Lord your God. And then He tells us what He's done. I have brought you out of the land of Egypt. I have brought you out of the house of bondage, out of the house of slavery. And now God tells us what He wants. He says in verse 3, you shall have no other gods before me. Now, we can understand why this is indeed the first and the foundational commandment. And probably, if you think about it, probably the most difficult one of all of them. You know, the greatest challenge in life, and in my life, is keeping God first. Is keeping God first. The hardest thing about being a pastor of a church is not preaching, though it's probably second. The hardest thing about being a pastor of His church is keeping God first in my life. Not letting church stuff get in the way of God's stuff. Not letting my personal things and the things that I think need to be done get in the way of my walk and my relationship with God. Folks, if my relationship falters, nothing that I say, nothing that I do means anything that I say. That only makes sense. Nothing that I say, nothing that I do means diddly, is what I'm trying to tell you. I'll get it out in a minute, I get excited. Especially if my walk is not right with God. Folks, the things that you say and do mean diddly if your walk and your actions aren't right with God. He has to be first. I read somewhere that someone said the Ten Commandments ought not to be thought of as rules or laws, but rather ought to be thought about as marriage vows. As marriage vows. And really, if you think about it, that makes sense. Because we're not in a law relationship with God. We're in a love relationship with God. And this tells us how He wants us to love Him. When was the last time, guys, your wife said, hey, love me like this? Cook my meals for me, clean my house for me, do all those things that I like. That's what God does. He gives us a guideline for how to love Him. God was saying to Israel, and He's saying basically to us, that I want to have that relationship with you, and I want you to have a relationship with me. And if our relationship is going to work, then these are the ground rules we've got to follow. And the first ground rule is simply, I am yours, and you are mine. I want to be your God. In fact, I am your God. Not that I just want to be. No other God can claim you. No other God can do what I can do for you. No other God will ever love you like I love you. Folks, listen carefully to the commandments and the way God worded these. You shall have no other gods before me. Now, that doesn't mean that it's okay to worship other gods as long as you put God first. As long as He's on top of the list. It says, you shall have no other gods before me. Before me. Those words, it's not an asking. It's not saying, hey, listen, put anything in front of me. Put me first. What He's literally saying is nothing before my face. Nothing. You could translate it this way. You shall have no other gods in my presence. Well, that kind of sums it up. Because God's everywhere. He's always in our presence. So folks, if we're going to love God the way He wants us to, then we can literally have no other gods in eternity, in this world, in our lives at all. Nothing. Because God is all. He's everywhere. He's all-knowing. He's omniscient. There's nowhere to hide from God. And that's what is so unique about this commandment and our God. Basically, He's saying, listen, with me, with God, it's all or nothing. Take it or leave it. There's no halfway. Folks, your home will never be blessed. You'll never have peace. You'll never have prosperity as long as you leave God out of your home. God is number one. I am the Lord your God. I've already taken care of you. I've already protected you. And I won't stand for anything but me in your life. It's your choice. Me or the world.